I think the property business is a scam. Could I pay you $10,000 to quit your job? Would you?
That's Simon Squibb, a prolific entrepreneur based here in the UK that sold his business for many, many millions. He's skyrocketed his fame via TikTok and now onto YouTube on multiple platforms, and he's absolutely risen in the ranks by having outlandish opinions. This has not gone unnoticed. Recently there's been some hit pieces against him, some people fighting back against him, but what's the truth? How did Simon Squibb really make his money? So Simon Squibb left home and actually became homeless at the age of only 15. He had a bit of a turmoil relationship, as he says on a lot of his podcasts, newspaper articles, interviews and things like that. He had a bit of a turmoil relationship with his mum, who was apparently a bit of a narcissist towards him. She gave him the ultimatum one day. She said, if you don't sort your stuff out, then I'm actually going to chuck you out the house. And he actually decided to just go ahead and leave. So he decided to leave the house. Apparently he was living in some sort of playground or park for a few days before he sort of ended up staying in some of these, I think they were sort of hostel type places, so he says in his podcast and things like that. You've seen him interviewed in. But instead of succumbing to the hardships of becoming homeless, he was homeless for around about 3 weeks. Instead of succumbing to that, Simon decided to take things into his own hands and decided to go ahead and start a gardening business. That was one of his first ventures. Now, I forgot to mention as well, Simon's dad actually died of a heart attack not long before he got chucked out of his house as well and became homeless, which obviously has a traumatic impact on any young kid, anyone, let alone any young kid as well, which obviously must have been really hard to deal with. Apparently Simon thought he was just acting, just playing around, but apparently he did actually have a heart attack, and shortly after he didn't make it, and unfortunately he did pass away. That was just before he moved out. So Simon went around on knocking on people's doors and offering to cut their bush, offering to do their garden. And it's actually quite a similar business that I had when I was younger as well. I did the exact same type of thing, knocking on people's doors, building up a gardening business. This was a way that he saw, which cost very little money to start, a way that he could start generating income fast. That was Simon's first venture. Now, Simon actually ended up growing this gardening business to around about 400,000 to 500,000 in turnover, which is actually really good. And I was surprised by that. The podcast guy that was interviewing him was also surprised by that. We thought it was just going to be him cutting a few bushes, making a few quid, but yeah, he actually got it to a fairly reasonable size turnover. I think it was around about 400,000 to 500,000 just from knocking on doors. And this showed Simon a lot of the business acumen, self-belief, knocking on doors, how far that can get you there. But unfortunately, something that he didn't take into account, and coming from someone myself that's built a business up, a gardening business up to 3 vans myself, and I have multiple staff members, what he didn't take into account was one thing in the UK called winter. Unfortunately, in winter, for around a couple of months, things just go absolutely dead. Around about 2 to 3 to 4 months, people just don't care about their gardens in winter, as Simon says on our podcast, and I know to be true myself, having had a gardening business myself. Winter was a real crux for that business. However, all of these struggles in the early days that Simon had, as he has personally emphasised on a lot of podcasts, were what showed him a vital key to success when you're becoming an entrepreneur, as he says in his words. And that's self-resilience. Having that self-resilience to persevere in hard times, losing his father, getting kicked out of his mother's house, didn't have a good relationship for her, having to knock on doors to make a bit of money to slowly build some sort of life for himself that he's happy with. That built him an extremely important skill of self-resilience, which he keeps talking about in a lot of the interviews that he has. And if we were to compare this to other self-made multi-millionaires, billionaires like Richard Branson, for example, who Simon's actually friend with, he had a bit of a similar upbringing in terms of at a very young age. He started these businesses, had real struggles. He tried to sell Christmas trees. He tried to even sell budgies, the birds' budgies, miserably failed until he got his first success, which was obviously the Virgin Records deal. It seems to be a massive theme with a lot of entrepreneurs. They fail very often in the early days until they've learnt them key principles of perseverance. Some other key lessons Simon says that he's learnt from his gardening business in the early days were understanding that providing real value as a small business can get you really far. It gave him that financial stability, the confidence in himself to actually go and get customers himself and understand that transactional value of just providing value to a customer and you get a return for that, i.e. money in this case. So he learned the key skills in entrepreneurship of financials, negotiation in business, acquiring customers, figuring out all your accounting and bookkeeping and stuff like that. All of them sort of foundations That's key. And that's what Simon learned in these times. However, at the age of 25, Simon made a very drastic turn and he ended up moving to Hong Kong. Hong Kong, where he later on decided to start an agency called Fluid. Simon ended up growing Fluid into being one of the #1 digital and branding agencies in the whole of Hong Kong. He was truly passionate about this venture. This was quite early on when these agencies weren't really a big thing. It was around about the 2000 time. I think he started it in 2000, so what I can see here. And he was catching some of the real international brands with the way that he built the business. He started to acquire some huge brands. And what he actually says in a lot of his videos, that sometimes it took him up to 9 years to actually acquire these big brands. But he said that perseverance was key here. He kept knocking on their doors until they accepted him as a client. One thing to note here is that Simon said his agency, now we don't know this to be true because we haven't got the data on this, but he said that his agencies was one of the only ones to survive in years to come. He said the reason for that was because he truly loved it. He was truly passionate about it and he truly made his team believe in the business to a level that no one else did. So all the agencies around him were going bankrupt and everything like that, all going out of business. But in the early days, he was told it was too competitive and that you shouldn't do an agency because everyone's got one. But he went on later to say that a lot of them were going bankrupt. A lot of them didn't make it because they didn't have the same love for the game that Simon has. Simon actually ended up at the same time as this, whilst he had the agency, investing quite a large sum of money into a comic book business. I've got written here in a comic book business. It was called Dever Shard, and that was in the late 20s, around about 2007 he had that. It was ambitious and sort of, aimed to disrupt the market, but unfortunately the investment was wasted, and he said he only lost around about 1.5 million in that investment. He's actually said in podcasts recently though that was one of his vital lessons. He said he really needed to understand business failure and what it was like and take that big hit in order for him to learn more fundamental lessons, which led him on to be more successful. So if you fast forward to 2015, Simon sold his company called Fluid to Price Waterhouse for an undisclosed amount. Now we think it's in the hundreds of millions. He says a sum that made him never have to worry about money again, ever, right? So yeah, 15 years later, in 2015, started in 2000, sold it in 2015 for an undisclosed huge amount apparently to PwC. So what do you do once you sell a business to one of the biggest firms in the world, PwC, and then have all of this money and never have to work again? Well, most people would strategically invest into other companies or invest in the stock market. Simon, or in property, which we'll talk about later, Simon decided to invest in other startups. So he actually invested, I've got written down here, 70 startups ranging from tech to health in the early days. Simon started investing his money and being a bit of an angel investor after this period. He actually invested in some of them to know, something called Heights, which is a wellness company, and he also invested in a company called Table Yeti, which was a digital dining platform. Now, you might be wondering, why hasn't he invested in property? Now, Simon's always had quite outlandish views when it comes to property. So as far as our knowledge goes, apart from his own residence that he subsides in, Simon doesn't actually have any property investments, so to say. Recently, there was a little bit of a feud between him and Samuel Leeds. Samuel Leeds, which is a very big property investor in the UK, an educator. He recently did a bit of a hit piece on Simon, I would like to call it myself. And because Simon's got very outlandish views when it comes to investing in property, he thinks property is a scam.
I think the property business is a scam.
And he thinks that anyone that calls themselves a business owner just because they invest in a few buy-to-lets is a scam as well. So very outlandish views there. I'll let you decide what you think's right. So moving forwards, after selling Fluid, having that failure with the comic book business and losing 1.5 million, which he attributes to the failure, he actually attributes that failure to having not enough passion in the business and not understanding the decision that he was making fully at all. And then he moved on to angel investing. So at this stage, he's got a load of money in the bank. He started angel investing as well, no property, doing the angel investing. And then that moves us straight forward to 2020, where he actually decided that he wanted to launch something called the Purposeful Project. Now, remember, this was in the COVID-19 times. This was a platform he created which gives aspiring entrepreneurs a lot of the resources completely for free that they need to start. The goal for this was to help 10 million people right here to start a business that don't have the resources that they need. Now, I believe it has now changed its name to Help BNK, Help Bank, and now it's more of a social media site, LinkedIn competitor, where people are meant to go on the site and just offer to help people without asking for anything in return. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting, and this is where Simon's fame comes into it, right? So Simon seems to have cracked the virality code when it comes to social media, and he definitely utilized TikTok on the way up for this, right? So Simon has a very special phrase that he calls "what's your dream?" Now that's the words that he uses when he goes up to randomers on the street. Now you would have seen him, this is probably how you came across Simon in the first place. Some of his TikTok videos have got over 100 million views. A lot of them 60, 50 million, 20, 30 million, all that kind of stuff. Crazy views. He also puts them he puts them on YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, YouTube videos. He's got his podcast as well. And he just kind of took over this business space in terms of social media content. I now believe he's got around about 9 million plus followers across his TikTok, his YouTube and everything like that. Now, with that kind of brand awareness, a creator could expect to earn 7 to 8 figures of personal income, I would assume, off the back of that. However, Simon's goal here, apparently from what he says, was never to monetize that financially too much for himself, because he's already made a lot of the money, as he said. He's got a movement called Give Without Take, and this encourages collaborative giving without taking. He believes that the world was meant to be give, not take. He doesn't believe in giving and taking. He believes in give, and then eventually you'll get what you want. So what does a guy do when he's got all the fame in the world, all the money in the world and everything like that? He's got a nice family and everything. What do you do at that stage? Simon continues to just give without take. This is his goal, and this is what he continues to do. Apparently, from what we can see and what the sources say on the web, he's not about, he's got a few sponsors in his YouTube videos and his podcasts and stuff like that, but he's not trying to constantly sell, unless there's some sort of strategic background thing that he's going to do in the future. Sure, he's building Help Bank, which is got the potential to be a huge, company worth millions in the future, I would say, especially with all the people that are endorsing it. If you look on the Help Bank YouTube channel, there's a lot of very successful entrepreneurs, marketing leaders, business people that seem to be behind that project as well. So it could be worth money in the future. Maybe that's what he's trying to do with his personal brand, to build that into a huge exit vehicle that he can use later. But I'm not so sure. I don't think so. I bumped into Simon the other day, had a 15-minute chat with him. He seems like a very sincere, genuine guy. And what I can say is, when I met him in person, he was exactly the same as what he was like when he was on camera, when I've seen him on camera. So I think he's a good guy. I think he's a good guy. I think he's monetizing it hardly at all, considering the following he's got. And he could be making a hell of a lot more money out of his personal brand. Now, if we were just to recap Simon's journey and just recap what we've learned from this, I would say that this is a great story of how you can go, it's proof to say that you can go from homeless, like parents not believing in you or not around, being chucked out on the streets, and then just fighting your way up to financial freedom and success as an entrepreneur. I think one of the key takeaways here is the risk factor. Now, Simon said in many of his podcasts, many of the podcast channels and everything like that I've seen him in, he says, luck is a skill, right? You get lucky by taking risks, right? And he always emphasizes the risk factor in everything. He says, as long as you take massive risk and just go all in on these things, he thinks it's really hard to fail. He thinks life is about taking massive risks, going all in, and just doing what you love, going after your dream. The question is, do you agree with that? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe, like the video. I'll see you in the next one.